termed modern black protest literature. Furthermore, at the time it constituted the most unrelenting and rage-fueled critique of white racism ever to surface in fiction written by blacks, directed toward a mainstream American readership. Native Son aptly deserves acknowledgement as the most influential African-American novel of the 20th century. However, it was Uncle Tom's Children that brought Wright to the attention of white critics and readers, many of whom had never encountered a black text that so moved and challenged them, thereby preparing the ground for Native Son, the book that changed the course of American letters. Born on September 4, 1908, to a schoolteacher and a former sharecropper who soon deserted his family, Richard Wright was raised by his mother and her relatives in a South dominated at nearly every turn by racial subordination. As his fellow author Margaret Walker puts it, the state of Mississippi, Adams County, USA, where Richard Wright was born, was a veritable hell. The system of segregation, known as Jim Crow, had been in place since the late 19th century, and lynchings and other savage physical assaults on blacks were not uncommon in the decades before World War I. Although Wright was not above exaggerating the harshness of his life to make a political point, it is clear from his autobiography that his youth in the South was scarred by constant, brutal repression. In particular, Wright viewed the attempt by whites to break the spirits of Southern blacks, to make them complicitous in their own oppression, as perhaps the key racist imperative, and he resisted as doggedly as he could. One form of both resistance and temporary escape for the young Wright was reading. Blessed with a vivid imagination, he found himself drawn early in life to books, as well as to creative writing, in no small measure because both were forbidden to him. At home, his authoritarian maternal grandmother condemned fiction as sinful, and in his community, whites refused to permit blacks access to the public libraries. On the one hand, the story of how Wright, as a young adult, was able to borrow library books by pretending to be acting on behalf of a white employer demonstrates his ingenuity and stubbornness. On the other hand, it indicates the extent to which the Southern racist code consistently forced blacks to participate in a self-abnegating and degrading masquerade. If, as Wright felt quite strongly, many blacks were too often willing to accede to such humiliation, he would not do so if he could help it. For a young black man in the South with such a rebellious attitude, there were few viable options. Flight was ultimately the one that Wright took. Wright left the South in late 1927 with a ninth-grade education and few marketable skills. To make matters worse, he had not been settled in Chicago long before the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression. The low point for Wright during these years came when he was forced to apply to the Bureau of Public Welfare in order to take care of his mother and brother, who had joined him in the city. If such nightmarish experiences served to exacerbate Wright's growing disenchantment with the American economic system, his reading not only helped him to begin understanding his painful, confusing reality, but also provided crucial models for meaningful self-expression. One of the most significant of these early models was H.L. Mencken, whose books Wright had tracked down while living in Memphis in the mid-1920s, after an editorial in a local white paper had vehemently attacked the iconoclastic and thorny social critic. Mencken's work had an immediate and galvanizing